Okay, well, welcome along to episode 71 of Sweet Tea and Coffee. I got to tell you, Blake, I had a conversation yesterday with a friend of the pod, a new friend of the pod. But this friend of the pod told an interesting story, and I'm trying to just figure out how crazy they are, because they said that they had wanted to listen to this for some time and just never gotten around to it. Well, their work world changed, and so they have a longer commute. They said, okay, I'm going to start listening to Sweet Tea and Coffee. And they have, let me just tell you this, they have listened to, in a very short amount of time, they have listened to 60 episodes of Sweet Tea and Coffee.
That's incredible, and
that's incredible.
I feel for them.
I feel for them too. That is way too much of your voice,
right?
For sure.
I'm sure it's it's just too much of me.
It's way too much of you, Blake. And that's actually what I wasn't going to say that on the air here, but that's what they said. And
that was on the review they wrote on the Apple Podcast.
Yeah, they said Blake talks way too much. Yeah. So anyway, but hopefully Blake doesn't talk as much in this episode. We've got George Middlebrook III in here with us, so we're excited to have him, and hopefully we'll get a whole lot of him and a whole lot less of you, Blake. But
it'll be a competition.
Let's do episode 71. Okay, so as I said, we've got George Middlebrook III in the house with us today, and he is very, very excited about being here. That's what he was telling us right before we went on the air, about how excited he was to be here. No, we really are glad to have you, but we always start with just a little warm-up question, a little softball before we really get into the tough stuff. And so, the show's called Sweet Tea and Coffee. I'm asking you here on the spot, but how much have you listened? Have you listened to any of these episodes? Maybe one, maybe two.
No,
maybe
I've listened to more than that. But
okay. So you're familiar with the show.
Mm-hmm. He's had some of his family on the show before, so
that's true.
Had to listen.
He had to listen, and we're meeting our quota of Middlebrooks this season by having him on this show.
That's right. Oh, that's good. Yeah. So you had some obligatory listens, but so kind of the flavor of the show, Sweet Tea and Coffee, and what we found is that a lot of times people have routines around coffee or tea or whatever it is that they drink in the mornings or afternoons or whatever. So do you have any kind of coffee routine or morning coffee? What's your drink routine?
I drink coffee. My wife doesn't drink coffee. And it seems like I get up usually before she does. And my first job is to go pour her Coke from the day before out, put new ice, open a bottle of Coke, set it there, sometimes pour it in, sometimes don't. She has a little hard time because of her stroke to open a bottle of Coke, but I have it for her. Sometimes I forget, but that's okay. And then I fix me coffee and sometimes a little orange juice, drink that, and then I'll have a second cup of coffee later, and that's it for the day.
And you and I are similar in that we have a hard cutoff for coffee. Or there's no sleeping.
Right.
So,
but usually I've gotten this year 2 cups, that's it, in the morning.
Okay. Well, husbands, take note.
Yeah.
The bar has just been set for taking care of your wife in the morning. So there's the standard. Glad that you're able to give us that. We said at the top of the show, you're a third. So you come in a line of Middlebrooks, and a line of Middlebrooks that have been here in Nacogdoches. You're comking. Or I don't know if it's competition or not.
I think they beat us out a little bit, just a little bit.
Blake's pretty proud of how long his people have been here. Middlebrooks have been in this area for a long time. What's the story of your family in Nacogdoches? How did you guys get here?
Well, I'll talk about the Middlebrooks first. If I can think through this a little bit and get it all right. Actually, they haven't been here as long as my mother's side, which were Mast, M-A-S-T. But my great-great-grandfather was in Lochapocha, Alabama, right after the Civil War. He had moved from Georgia to Alabama. I've been and found his actual grave way out in the middle of the woods. And I think he was born in, right before the Civil War. And the story goes that when the war was over, there was a band called the Russo's Raiders came through that area around Opelika, tore up the railroad track. I think there were some of Sherman's men and did a lot of devastation. And one day a band of those soldiers came through, and that would have been my great-great-great-grandfather sent one of his boys around the bar and said, "Go hide." And the story is the soldiers went around there, he heard a shot, killed his son.
Wow.
The story goes that it broke his heart and he died. But he had these two young boys. One was my great-great-grandfather, and one would have been his brother, two orphans now. And their mother put them in a buckboard wagon and headed west because they had a good bit, 300 acres of land. They farmed it with slaves. That's the story of so many families in East Texas. And a lot of our heritage came from the South. Slave owners, war was over, and they had to get out of Dodge because they were burning their places down and taking over their farms, and some of previous slaves took over these tracts of land. But anyway, she took these two little boys, covered them up in a wagon, headed west, stopped in Louisiana, stayed a while. I don't know if it was a year or two or three, but anyway, ended up in Hope, Arkansas. And so in Hope, Arkansas, that was where my father's grandfather was born, my great-grandfather, and then my grandfather was born there as well. My great-grandfather, my grandfather's father, or my father's grandfather, was a bivocational pastor in rural Arkansas. And I've often said, I believe I know my own faith in our family's Christian faith had to come from these ancestors who were strong believers that came to Texas. But anyway, my grandfather was born there, and he went to medical school, graduated, one of the first graduates of a real medical school in 1908 in St. Louis, Missouri, started working at sawmills as sawmill doctors, and got several jobs at a lot of places, but ended up at Cairo, which is up
my neck of the woods.
Up in your neck of the woods, and was a sawmill doctor. My dad was born in 1917 in Nacogdoches County in a place called Dunham Switch. Now, a switch would be where a railroad went. So all these sawmills were in these towns like Nacogdoches, St. Augustine, and they ran railroad tracks out into the woods because they couldn't transport logs any other way. So they would be every 5 miles out in the middle of these big woods. They would drag the logs up there with mules, load them on a train car, bring them to the sawmill. So that was a switch for one of the mills where they loaded logs. My grandfather and my grandmother, I guess, were out there doing their medical stuff, whatever, and my dad was born in 1917. And by night, they lived in western Louisiana, East Texas, and by 1932, they moved to Nacogdoches into town, built a house up on North Street, and from then on, we've been living here. So that was my dad's side of the story.
Wow. So quite the journey. In
my mother's, you want to hear my mother's side?
Yeah, sure.
So my mother was a MAST, M-A-S-T, and her story really would begin in the Germany, Switzerland area of Western Europe. And so in about 1740, my ancestors, my MAST ancestors then, were Amish Mennonites, and they had to flee because of religious persecution. Of course, that was certainly after the Reformation and all that, but there was a lot of upheaval in religious communities over there. So there was, again, 2 brothers and about a few sisters, and they had to flee, and they were orphans as well. And their uncle, Johannes Mast, understand the story to be, of course, all this is just anecdotal.
Right.
They got on a ship called the Providence, and they sailed from Bern, I think it is, which is close to the town of Goodisburg where they lived. Carla and I made a trip over there along with David and Sheila a few years ago to Goodisburg. And we went to the church there, looked at the cemetery. A lot of people there named Mass, but Johannes took these two brothers and these girls, and they sailed. I don't know how long it took them, but they finally made it to Philadelphia. Interestingly, in 1740-ish, whenever they got here, Philadelphia was the second largest city in the British Commonwealth, the British people. There were 15,000 people, and it was the second largest city behind London. So they were some other Amish people there that ended up being there, of course, in Lancaster County. The story we got is of these two brothers. Ours was Joseph, and the other, let's see, I'm going to get that wrong. I should have written that down. There was two brothers. One of them kind of seemed to be more religious than the other. He wasn't our ancestor. The one a little less religious was ours.
Yeah.
And they got their mind, he got his mind together. Look, this is not a big enough place for both of us boys. And so he heard about some more Amish people or Christian people down in North Carolina. And besides that, the story goes, he kind of liked this concept of slavery. You know, am I proud of that? No. But he said, hey, I'm going to go down to North Carolina. He left his brother there. Now, his brother, I understand, was the first ordained Amish bishop in the United States. Now, there were some came over from Europe, but his brother was the first Amish. And so I've been to Lancaster County. It's kind of like going to Alabama and seeing Bear Bryant's picture all in the bathrooms. There, everywhere you went was a picture of this first first Amish bishop. And so my grandfather, or my grandfather went to North Carolina, established land, bought land, had some slaves. And in about 1850-ish, he came to Nacogdoches County from North Carolina.
Wow.
I've been back to North Carolina, too, where he lived in Brown Boone, North Carolina. Came to Melrose, Texas. He had a brother who'd come a few years before that to Melrose. He came and kind of set up shop and lived there. And the story I hear, a few years later, he went back to North Carolina, brought his slaves with him, 15 of them, and got land around Center Point, Pisgah area, which some of y'all may know where it is. And so when he came back, eventually my great-grandfather, who was born to live there in Melrose, had 6 boys. One of them was my grandfather. And so that's kind of the story of that.
Wow. You are deeply acquainted with your story. I mean,
well, hey, if you've ever been to his office, he's got, like, right as you walk in, there's this big, massive family tree painted on the wall. It's one of the coolest things to be able to track that and look at all these. I mean, all these names that he's mentioned are on there, so it's neat.
Where does all of that work come from? I mean, have just generations before you kept diligent recordings of story? I mean, there's just so many families that would not be able to talk about things that way. How has that come about?
Well, Kendall, there is a big book about 3 inches thick on the Middlebrook family that traces it from England and Ireland and Scotland over there from back in whatever, 1300s. And so we know about that. There's also a mass family history that goes way, way back. But I've just kind of got a little interested in it, but I haven't done the genealogy. I've got a brother who has. I've got a niece who's done a lot of it. But these are just some anecdotal stories. Yeah. So.
Well, it's neat that you have that. It's neat to reflect on the journey of your family. And
I've got another family. My mother's father was Mass. My mother's mother was a Summers, S-U-M-M-E-R-S. They as well came from the South, and I don't know exactly where they came to, but they were some of the, I think, charter members at Old North Church. Several of them are buried at Old North Church. Baptist people again, all these people now. So I've just look at that as a great Christian heritage of these people who went before us.
Yeah, yeah. Well, talk to me a little bit about what life was like for you growing up. Is your mom and dad met and were establishing life together in Nacogdoches. What was it like for you growing up?
Well, as you know, looking at me, I'm certainly a baby boomer, born in 1950. We lived in a white frame house, real nice people. I went back, and the house was for sale this last year, and I went back and looked at it. And if you've ever been back to a house you grew up in, man, it's a lot different than what you thought. Smaller.
Oh, yeah.
Looks different. And so there was a few key things I wanted to look at. I only lived there till I was about 8 years old. We had, of course, one telephone in the house with a wire on it. It was in a little alcove in the hall. It was there. No air conditioning, a big ceiling fan. And I looked for all those kind of things. The house looked a lot smaller than it did to me as a child. But anyway, so we grew up, lived there. 1958, my parents built a house on Norma Street. Now, Norma Street at that time was way out of town in the city. So my mother, and let me go back to my mom for a minute if I can. She was born in a house on Mound Street about 100 feet from Hospital Street. And that's almost downtown. She was born there in 1918. Her parents married in 1914. And so that's where town was. And then later on, after she got out of college, they moved way out Regay Street to about Burroughs Street.
Oh, yeah, Burroughs. That's way out of town.
And so town has continued to move. So we moved when I was in 1958. I was 8 years old. There was a lot of, the war was over by 5 years. There was a lot of military people came back. That's what caused that baby boom. All these couples got together and had children. Well, I was right in the middle of that.
Yeah.
And so they started putting streets, and they were not subdivisions like we think of them now. They just were street go down, terminate at the creek, another street go down. It was just straight streets. So all these streets just had houses on them. Well, we were the last house on Norma Street. First house, last house on the end of it. So we moved there 1958, and before long, the street got populated by more houses. Most of them little brick, 3-bedroom, 2-bath houses. They were mostly folks my parents' age, a little younger, who'd been in the service, came back, and literally our street was just inundated with kids my age. Baby boom kids, from 6 years old to 12 years. We were just everywhere, up and down. So that's kind of where my story went. Now, the rest of my life began there, too. So every time a new house would be built, I would look expectantly. Is there going to be a boy there? What are we going to do? More kids to play with? Because, we wanted them. And in that day, there was no Nintendo. You came home from school, you didn't go inside, you played on the street until dark. And maybe they'd ring a bell, you'd come home. It was a lot different. No Nintendo, no computer games or anything like that. So you played outside. And there was a creek at the end of our street, so you played in the creek. You played with all the kids on the street. But 2 years later, in 1960, there was a house being built. And, of course, we were looking at that house and said, I hope we have a boy come in we can play with. So, sure enough, they got the house built. The day came. They moved in. And I was kind of expecting, who are these kids going to be? There was 2 girls came out of that house. Well, the first one was my sister-in-law. And I knew real quick I wasn't going to get along with her. And if I looked at her wrong, she ran back in the house to tell her mom. The other girl came out, and I said, man, this is going to be a good companion. She's sort of half tomboy. She works with her daddy. I can get along with this girl. And that's who I'm married to. So anyway, we got to be really good friends, Carla and I, right there.
How old were you at that?
Well, I was 10 and she was 8.
Wow.
And I guess it was a sense I tell her, I don't know, I hope I'm right about it. That's when I fell in love with her. But I spent a lot of time at their house for a lot of reasons. And what I liked about her dad raced cars, raced go-karts, raced boats, worked in a shop behind his house. And she spent a lot of time out there in her dad's shop because she was sort of the boy. Her sister was not.
Yeah.
So I kind of liked that. And so I started spending a lot of time at her house for her dad a lot. My mom, when I grew up, she realized she had rheumatoid arthritis. I don't know, somewhere around college, maybe after, I don't know, maybe a little bit before. So all my life growing up, my mom had rheumatoid arthritis. It got worse over time, and eventually she was completely wheelchair bound, had a lot of deformity. But even back then, she was able to walk and maybe drive a car some as I was growing up, but she required a lot of help. She wasn't able to do for us as kids, cook and all that, as much as normal parents would be. So I kind of migrated to spending time at Carla's house. In fact, I tell people I ate more meals at her house growing up than I did at my own house. And so it was just typical for me to be at her house most of the time, except when I was asleep. Not all the time, but a lot of times. So we became really good friends, and especially as we got a little bit older. I got my driver's license at 14. Had my first wreck driving myself to Boy Scouts at 12, so it was a different day back then. Yeah. But
hold on,
yeah, you heard that right.
Yeah. Did I hear that right?
Yeah,
The driver's license at 14, first wreck at 12.
Right, that's right.
Okay,
so Carla didn't get her driver's license, so I drove her a lot of places. When I had a driver's license, she didn't quite have one left. So I spent a lot of time up there working. I'd go to drag races with her dad and her a lot. So anyway, that's kind of how life started for us. What's kind of unusual, you probably don't care about my love life, but I was a dork. I still am one. I admitted it. I didn't play sports growing up. I'm not athletic now. I wasn't athletic then. So the whole dating scene, girls want to go with athletes, and I wasn't an athlete. But I figured out something by the time I got about a senior in high school, that these 9th graders and 10th grade girls, it didn't care if you played football. If you were a senior, you could get a date with one of them. So I really made up for dating in my senior year. But they were all 9th graders, 10th graders. I never dated anybody my own age. But all through high school, well, when Carla got in, she was a beautiful girl, still is. When she got in junior high, she was a cheerleader. She always had a boyfriend. So all through high school, she dated a big football player. In fact, he was a year older than I am. And so while we were friends during the week and on the weekends, we never did have a date. I mean, we were like really best friends. We did stuff together. But she had her boyfriend, and eventually I had started going to these young girls, which every one of them, I'm a dork, and I'm also a romantic. I fell in love with every one of them. I thought every one of them was what I wanted. But it's kind of strange. I remember Kendall, even back then, thinking to myself a lot of times when I was alone, thinking about things that, I love this girl I'm going with this week, and but am I gonna do what I love right now, or am I gonna do what I know I should do is marry Carla? But how do I do that?
Yeah.
She won't talk to me.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's kind of how our high school experience went. We were very, very good friends. So when I got out of high school, all I really, and I will say this, I'm not sure, I think it came from my dad. He was a surveyor, and he had me work with him all the time, but I've had a real passion for work. I like to work all the time. In fact, Carla has often told me, she said, George, I can compete against another woman. I got the tools to do that. I can't compete against your working. And if there's ever been a tension in our marriage, it's been working too much or whatever you'd say, just not do it. Even with my kid growing up, my kids, I spent a lot of time working. So anyway, when I got out of high school, that next Monday, I already had a job lined up. I went to work at Bright Cup Company, and so my first year of college, I worked 40, 50, 60 hours a week, took about 14 hours, and I just didn't, whatever. I didn't have time. I think I had one date in college with a college girl, but that was it. So Carla was 1 year behind me in school. Well, I had this pattern when I'm at the end of the street. She's about a third of the way up the street. I drive by her house every day several times. So when she graduated from high school, I say it was the next day after she graduated, but she says it's about a week later. But anyway, every day when I'd come home from work, Bright Cup Company, I just naturally turned in her driveway. That's what I did in my pattern for years. I'd go over there, hang out with them, work with her dad, see her, whatever. And I pulled in there, stopped my car, and she came, opened the door, got in the front seat. And that wasn't really that unusual. We're really good friends. Say, what are you doing today? How's it going? She came in and sat down. I said, what's going on? I said, well, you're going to take me on a date tonight. I said, I don't think so. Your boyfriend's a lot bigger than me. She said, no, I broke up with him today. I said, what? You've been dating him all this time? Yep, you're going to take me out. I said, that's going to kind of really feel a little funny taking you on a date. And she said, yep, you're going to come pick me up. So we went on a date, and I don't remember. I think it was The Sound of Music, but I don't know. It's some movie we went to. So we came back, and I thought, I've dated a lot this last year, the year before, and I said, I know what you do. You come, you walk them to the door, you tell them good night. If you're lucky, you get a kiss. But I said, this is going to be real weird with Carla.
Yeah.
So we got back there, and I don't know what happened. She said, well, you can walk me to the door. Well, I walked to the door. So I got to the door. I said, okay, I'll see you tomorrow, whatever. She said, well, aren't you going to kiss me goodnight? And it was just one of those real weird things. I said, I don't know if I can kiss you. It'd be like kissing my sister.
Oh gosh!
And that probably wasn't a good.
That's
comment.
probably the worst thing you could have said.
It probably was.
That thing was set up for you, and that's what you said.
I said that. I told you I was a dork. I said, I don't know if I can kiss you. You're like my sister, but it worked out. I did kiss her.
You've been married how long?
52 and a half years.
Wow.
So anyway, went on. That night was over. We started dating, and by November we were engaged. And the next year at spring break at SFA, April, we got married. So it didn't take too long because we'd known each other for 10 years. But that summer of 1970, when she'd graduated, we started dating, is when I started coming to Fredonia Hill. And we've been going here ever since then. She went here. I started coming here. Her parents and grandparents, they'd been here for a long time. In fact, one time on Mother's Day, it was really neat. I wish I had a picture of it, but they asked mothers to come down, and they had Carla, her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, and her great-grandmother. They had Christy, Carla, her mother, her grandmother, and great-grandmother. 5 generations of girls that went to this church in front of our church.
Wow. Well, that is an interesting point to kind of start talking about the development of your faith. I mean, you're talking about starting here at Fredonia Hill. Were you a Christian at that point? Were you a new believer? Where was your faith? How did that form and develop leading up to that point?
I was born in 1950. My daddy's daddy was a deacon at Lily Grove Baptist Church. They came from a Baptist background. My dad did. Of course, he went to war. He was older going into the war. He wasn't in the military. He was associated with the Pan American World Airlines, putting in radio stations for the military. But when he got back, he surrendered to preach about the time I was born. And so all my life growing up, on Sundays, my daddy, my father, would go to where he preached. He preached at Alizan, he preached at Melrose, he preached at Sharina. And so we didn't go to church with him much till later. My mother, as I said, had arthritis, so she had a little hard time getting us up. So my mother's sister, Sally T. Summers, who's one of the ladies who helped start Fredonia Hill Baptist Church, she was in the WM group that came over here.
Did Sunday school. Yeah.
So she would come pick myself, my two brothers up every Sunday morning, take us to First Baptist Church. We did that from the time I was born. She taught Sunday school up there, I think, for 75 years at First Baptist Church or something like that. So I started going to church up there when I was 11. I went forward. I was baptized. You know, we talk about our faith. When did we become believers? You know, for some people, it's like Paul, but other people, it's not quite so much. But I've not ever not been going to church. As I got a little older in high school, I started driving my dad. That's how I learned to drive, driving to Sharina on Sunday morning, so he didn't have to drive. So that's kind of my background. My mom went to Wheaton in college. Then she went to Southern Seminary in Louisville and training in Christian education, taught Bible at our BSU at the university. So I've got an extensive background of Baptist Christian believers that's part of my heritage. Now, when I talk to people about their faith, sometimes they say, oh, my mom was a Christian, my grandmother, we don't get to be believers because of our parents, our grandparents. Right. It's a yielding of ourselves, putting our faith and trust in Jesus Christ and Him alone. And so I can't say, but the effect of our heritage has a huge effect on it.
Sure.
My mom's mom, she died in 1946 before I was born, apparently was a woman of great faith. Or otherwise she wouldn't have sent her daughters to Wheaton and all those kind of things. But when my mom was little, they would travel all over the country going to Bible conferences, Dr. Ironsides, and some of those names we know from the early part of the 1900s. And so, but the story goes, my mother was born on Mound Street. I told you, about a block off of Hospital Street. And her mother, of course, mother and daddy there. But her mother bought books after books. It was a Christian book. She bought it. It wasn't the internet, but and I have inherited some of those books, and you know, I've seen a lot of them. But she spent a lot of her money on books. So my grandfather, as being a businessman, he looked at that. He goes, "Wait a minute, you're just spending all our money on these Christian books." So he kind of was a business oriented, so he bought the house across the street on Mound Street, a rental house, and he gave it to my mother's mother, his wife, and said, okay, I'm buying this house across the street from us. It's your house. You can rent it. All the rent that comes in on it is your money. You spend all that on books you want to, but after that, that's it. No more money. Your budget is what you rent. So I think she spent every nickel from that out. So that just gives you a little flavor of where, you know, I got to be where I am. I can't take credit for it. I wasn't a Hell's Angel that got reformed. I have been involved in the whole Christian thing all my life.
Well, I think, and that's interesting because as I've gotten to know you over the years, you come back to a few real key moments in your life and the way that those key moments overlap with moments here at Fredonia Hill. Fredonia Hill has been a huge part of you and Carla's life. And one of the things that I think about, and you can just kind of help catch us up on the timeline and kind of when this would have happened. But I feel like I've heard you tell stories about being handed responsibility here at this church in kind of an unexpected way, being asked to teach Sunday school, being asked to lead this or lead that. and people putting you in positions to lead out. And I think I remember those being in moments where, I mean, you were a young man, and early on in y'all's marriage, and early on in the development of your family, and kind of having to step into, or being asked to step into leadership roles. Am I remembering that right? Or
I can't deny that. I maybe the story, or maybe what you heard was something I said. So we got married. I was working at Bright Cup Company, going to school. Carla was working at the college. I was going to school. And my supervisor, my boss, or whatever at Bright Cup was a man named Joe Biggerstaff. Now, Joe went to this church for many years. He worked in a lot of things. And the first year or two after I was married, he was, I think, the Sunday school director, which is a term we used to have around these Baptist churches, for the junior high department. And so one day I was at work. He said, "George, I want you to start teaching 7th grade boys, and you show up down there in the department. It's downstairs down here, maybe where it was."
Yeah.
And so I show up down there, and that day, there was an opening assembly, and then little bitty rooms all around. Room about big enough, about 10 people, and the big room had about enough for 30 or 40. So the session was over, and he said, "Okay, George, here's our classroom." I went over there, and the boys, these 7th grade boys, all went in there, and he opened the door, and I don't know if it's exactly, but it's the way I remember it, that he pushed me in there and locked the door behind me. And there I was.
We still do that. That's still a technique we use today.
So
we're looking for some Sunday school teachers right now.
Right.
Yeah.
So here I am with all these 7th grade, whatever you call a 7th grade boy. They're not quite as bad as the 7th grade girls, but it's not easy. Now, what's kind of scares me is the other night at our legacy banquet, Mark Clark was there, and I'm not sure if he was one of those boys or not, but these kids were like Rex Perry and some of those. Now they're well in their 60s, and they were these 7th grade Indians or heathens or whatever. So that was my first experience right there teaching. It was, and I guess I enjoyed that. Maybe, I don't know. I've got some.
You probably learned something from it.
Maybe. But I appreciate Joe looking, and all along through our lives, whether it's the people that have done it in my life, who've taken an interest to disciple me when I didn't even know that's what they were doing, to maybe I helped disciple somebody that I didn't know what I was doing. But discipleship, I know there's programs and books and all those things you can do. It's like evangelism. But I think the best evangelism and the best discipleship is when it's organic, it's natural, and you make relationships with people. And through the process of that, the greatest thing that would ever happens to a believer is someone comes to you and says, "There's something different about you, Kendall. What is that? I want to have that." And so that's the kind of thing that I hope has happened. It's happened certainly to me as I've looked in other people's lives. So that's how I got started. It wasn't too long. I guess I found out this about Baptists. Maybe there are other denominations, but if you'll agree to do anything, you get all the work you want. And so people would start asking me to do this, that, and other, eventually become a deacon, do that. I've been on, I think now, 5 pastor search teams. I've been every other committee. We used to do things in Baptist churches called committees. We don't really have that much anymore. But in that day, and I remember, and this, I'm not saying this is a good thing, but when my kids were little and we were young marrieds, we were at church literally, I think, every day. 2 services on Sunday, plus GAs, plus RAs, plus I was training union director, Wednesday night prayer meeting, brotherhood on Monday night once a month, deacons meeting twice, whatever. And it wore people out. It wore me out. It was, I think, too much. Now, some people might listen to this and say, "Wait a minute, you're a heathen. You're not really a Baptist." Well, maybe I'm not a Baptist anymore. I don't know. But, you know, we can do too much, and we really need. I recently heard a sermon about taking a Sabbath day's rest. You preached on it. My little church I go to in Alabama, he really reached and preached a great sermon on that. And last week I was just burned out. And that's why I didn't come to church on Sunday, because I said I need to take a Sabbath day here. It doesn't mean I just had to take some time Sunday to rest. Now, I listened to our church service for John. It was good, and I listened to my church in Alabama, and it was good. So maybe I heard more preaching than I normally do.
Yeah.
You know, but it was good. But so, you know, if you were in a Baptist church and you say, yeah, you're going to do it, you raise your hand. You don't even have to raise your hand. So I learned that when I was in any kind of Baptist meeting and it looked like it's fixing to get convicting, I sat on my hands so they wouldn't think I was.
Don't make any eye contact either.
Don't make any eye contact. So anyway, so things came along. I got involved in one thing and another. I went in business in 1973, latter part. I was in the sawmill business, and I finally sold my business in 93. But about 1990, I closed my mill down, and I didn't really know. I grew up. Some people have heroes of movie stars. Some people have heroes of athletes, but I wasn't athletic. And we didn't get to watch movies. Another thing about my early childhood, because my mother came from a real strict, strong, staunch Baptist background, there wasn't alcohol in our home, certainly no cigarettes. There weren't playing cards. There was no gambling, and no dancing. Now that's kind of gone by the wayside. But I didn't get to go to dances when I grew up. My parents wouldn't let me. There's a lot of things we didn't do, we didn't experience. But when I grew up and got married, we started going to church here. Things were a little bit different, I guess you'd say. So I had a train of thought there, and it just escaped me.
That's all right. I want to get to the period of time here at this church that people often come back to and talk about. It's a really important era, I think, for Fredonia Hill with Brother Dodson and leadership, and that stretch of time during the late 70s and the 80s, right? Late 70s. I'm looking at Blake.
He was here through the 60s, through the 80s.
Yeah. All the way, but particularly kind of slowing down in the 80s. You've talked to me. I remember one of my very first conversations with someone here at Fredonia Hill was with you, and I was coming in 2011 to do college ministry, and in one of our very first conversations, you told me about in the 80s the way that God was moving within the college ministry, particularly with an emphasis on people going and serving the Lord in a variety of different contexts, and you kind of watching that, being part of that, watching God work in that way, the church. Talk a little bit about, you've shared that with our college students at various points, but talk a little bit about that time period and particularly just the impact that had on you, because I know that missions is a huge part of what God has called you to do in ways you've led here. So talk a little bit about kind of that era and Brother Dodson's impact on you and just that span of time.
Well, I wasn't going to church here till 1970. I think I visited a time or two. Brother Dodson came here in 1967. His wife, Joyce, basically was our college ministry director, taught Sunday school to the college students. So I came in 70. By the time I got here, I was married, but I was going to college, but I really wasn't a college student because I was a married student. And a lot of the stuff going on in the college department wasn't going on in our young adult department, but it was going on. Joyce taught in there. And it was 200 or 300, 400 kids in there every week, and they were really, God was using it. But remember, we were in a time in 1971 where there was a huge Asbury College had their big revival. There were revival meetings. There was a Jesus movement. And there was a lot of emphasis on college young people, kind of like we had a little bit of surge this year about. So there was a lot of going on. We had in our church at one time, I remember, kind of like we did this year for the first time in a long time, we'd have 50, 60, 100 kids lined up at the first of summer that were going to summer mission somewhere. And I don't know how many college students through Fredonia Hills College Ministry and Nacogdoches went to the mission field. At one time, Southern Baptist said that Fredonia Hill had sent and more college students or more people into foreign missions than any church in the association. I don't know if that's true or not, but they were very dynamic.
Yeah.
And it went on for a good, time. Now, we talk about the years. 1982 would be a dividing line in our church where we kind of had a split.
Yeah.
So all that happened in the 70s, basically up to 1982. I remember in our old auditorium, what we call the Gateway now, that's where we met. In our current sanctuary, we built in 1978, and when we were at our legacy banquet the other day in that building, Mark was at our table, and I said, Mark, do you remember the Sunday we moved in here in 1978? Wow. And I remember right where I was sitting. Well, I was 28, he was 10 or something. I don't know how old he was. He was maybe younger than that. But yes, we've been in that building. So anyway, I'm going to go back. I've remembered exactly what I was going to say a while ago about growing up. People's heroes, my heroes were missionaries. And I really loved their missionary stories. So when I sold my business in 1990, I started doing mission work. But that may be for another time or another question. I don't know. But things were really moving along here in those early 80s. I do remember we used to have these boards in Baptist churches. Maybe some of the little country ones still have them, and to say average attendance today, how many people checked all their boxes on their card, all those kinds of things. But we always knew how many people were in Sunday school that week. And the highest number I ever saw there was 984 people. And that was when we were meeting. Had less, we had a lot of folks coming. This was in the 70s, maybe up to 1980 or 82.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, you talked about the split in the 80s, and I know that for you, again, having spent time with you hearing stories, that was the period of time after that split occurred, and what God did with this church in dealing with the disunity and putting those pieces back together, and the way that God brought about revival of sorts here, certainly an outpouring of repentance and humility, trying to repair the broken witness within the community through the ministry of Life Action. You were part of that. You were here when that went on, and that was a really important part of your journey. And so take us into that a little bit. That's a hard thing. I mean, people that are listening, if you've ever been through church discord, and lots of people have those stories, it can be really painful. It can be very difficult. You certainly walked through that, but you also saw what God did in the aftermath and some of the restoration. What was that like for you as you lived through all of that?
Well, when we had our split, and I think that's the only name you could put to it,
sure.
1982, I would have been 32 years old. We had a lot of young couples, college, still had a lot of college students, and I was a little confused about what was going on. I hadn't become a deacon yet, but I was involved in Sunday school and different jobs, and I was trying to raise a bunch of young kids. My children were born from 72 to 78, so it wasn't long after that. Our kids were all very young. And so I don't know that I knew what was going on politically, if you can say that, and the leadership and the deacons. And even now people say, well, I heard y'all split because of X, Y, Z, and everybody's got their opinion what happened. I've got my own. But it was a bad time. It was almost split right down the middle. And we had a lot of Wednesday night. Of course, then we had Wednesday night business meetings. And I remember some of those distinctively in the old auditorium, Gateway. And in one particular one, if this gives you a little flavor of what was going on, in the process of that, I think Brother Dotson felt the leadership that he was a pastor, but he knew all this was going on, that it might be best for him to resign, and he did. But there was a movement to say, okay, you've been our pastor since 1967. You live in the parsonage, and there was a recommendation to give him the parsonage. And so we were voting on that particular issue that night. And so several Wednesday nights we had these meetings about different things about the church. It was kind of where that split kind of really got boiled up. And so we were going to vote whether to give him the parsonage. And so this was on a Wednesday night. And so one of the deacons said, hey, George, would you help count these votes? And so they picked 2 or 3 of us. We went in a room. They voted a little secret ballot, pieces of paper. And we went in there and we counted them. To kind of give you an idea of what happened, it was 267 to 268 or something like that. It was almost a 100% split with about 1 vote more not to give him the parsonage. Wow. So our church was really divided down the middle. Most of my personal friends and people I looked up to and cared about actually made the decision to leave. And I have no hard feelings about there. A lot of them that are my friends to today. But I just didn't feel led to leave my family to leave. Whether my heart went with those who did leave was a whole different issue. I had to decide. And I'm thankful I stayed. Yeah. And I've been here. And I wasn't the only one who stayed. There were those that stayed who were glad some of those who left. Some of us wish they hadn't left. I mean, there's all kind of feelings. But now that's been 40 years ago, okay? But it's one of those things that happens that you don't get over. So we had our split. And we really got down to a lot lower numbers. And so what happened, those that did stay, I'd say, had to pick up the responsibility. Soon after that, even as a 30-something-year-old, I was asked to be a deacon. Others did. And so we went along there pretty good. We had, after that, we had a pastor search committee, and we called a young man out of Troop, Texas, Charlie Neighbors, who was very, very popular, charismatic, great teacher. Maybe you've heard about him. He was a great guy. And one week I was in his office, where his office was here, and we talked. We had some discussion about some things. And that day he left to go to Houston with his wife to a doctor's appointment at Greens Road. A truck, because the rain crossed the line, they went up under it, and they were both killed immediately. So we got the news. I was actually, again, on the day school board in a day school meeting in the day school building, and somebody came in and gave us that news. That wasn't it was a different shock, I guess you'd say, than having a split. Yeah. But nevertheless, it was a huge impact. People had gone through the split. That was about 84-ish, 85, I don't remember. We'd gone through this split, a lot of tension. Here we were, had this young, he was teaching through the book of Revelations. Charlie was my age, 32 years old. Wow. Dynamic. And then one day you lose your pastor. Now, for me, I handled that pretty good, but it was very, very, very traumatic to a lot of people. So we've got, bam, a big thing. 2 years later, another big hit. Okay, so then we have another pastor search, and I didn't want to be on them, but I got on another one, and we called Steve James from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, I guess. And Steve had a great ministry. Steve brought a lot of things. I think every time somebody comes, a new pastor, I always say, regardless of what happened, they bring some great things to us. Now you're going to have to stay a little longer.
Hadn't happened
We're still
yet.
waiting to see.
We're still waiting to see how that comes out. Steve brought to us Evangelism Explosion, a lot of really good ministry kind of things. But one day I was walking down the hall, right across the hall here, and Steve was in the hall, and he said, "George, come here just a minute." Of course, again, we were about the same age. At that time, maybe we were later 30s. He said, "I got this pack of information. I want you to read through it and think about this." I said, "Okay." My pastor used to do that. I'm over the hill now, and they don't ever ask me for advice anymore. I guess I was the only guy around he knew. So I took this information, I started reading it. It was about this organization called Life Action Ministries. And the story was they'd bring this team of 25 people to your church, stay about 3 weeks. I didn't know what all they'd do. How could they spend 3 weeks? But they took the church over. They did Sunday school. They did Sunday morning. They do the music. They dismissed the staff from having any responsibility. They were just like a church member, come to church. And so they rolled into our parking lot, 25 at least of them. The college kids stayed in people's houses. The adults on the team stayed in trailers on our lot, which was a bunch of them. And they did stay 3 weeks. And we had all kind of services at night, every night of the week, but maybe the second Monday night. But the ministry, we were always used to, well, we're going to have a revival. What's a revival? You bring a revivalist. He preaches hellfire and brimstone, teaches the gospel. We need that. But it was a little different flavor. It wasn't being preached to the lost people. We didn't have pack the pew night, bring all your lost friends and neighbors. It was like, church members, this is for you. And it was a very, very convicting time because for the first time in a long time, somebody came to our church and was asking the believers that were born again, hopefully born again, about their faith, about their surrender, who they were in Christ, their identity in Christ, all those kind of things. And so it was a real time for, I would have to use the term soul searching, a lot of sleepless nights, a lot of thinking about, well, am I really a believer? Am I really following the Lord? Is there sin in my life I need to deal with? And so during that time, there was people in our church who we all thought were believers who came forward and said, "I'm really not a Christian. I want to get saved." And a lot of other people under conviction for things. It's the same kind of atmosphere I think they saw at Asbury this year and in a lot of the college campuses where God just began a movement. And so a number of us as young men would come up here every night and pray. God was doing a real deep work, I'd say, if you can use that term, in the lives of believers, in my life, in our family's life. And so we still say before Life Action and after Life Action, more so for the first 15 years of that. But if you talk to people in our church now who were here that was January of 1988. And so it had been 6 years since our split. During the course of that, the lead evangelist, the head of that ministry, was Dale Fazenfeld Jr. is enough of rumblings. He knew something went on, and he got to what's happened, and he discovered about this split in 1982, and he met with several of us as deacons and said, hey, I believe there's something here that needs to be dealt with. And so he got the idea for us to come up, realize that we had failed our community. We had not been the kind of testimony as a Christian church we should be. So we got together as a deacon body. Now remember, about half the people already left, so only half the people were still here. And so we, with his encouragement, had a reconciliation service. We invited everybody who'd previously been a member of our church to come back, including Brother Dotson, and tried to say, look, we've been part of the responsibility of this thing. We're sorry. And we took out a full-page ad, and maybe we've got a copy of it somewhere, of confessing the sins we had, of discord, all the things we did, and everybody was responsible for that, and asked the community to forgive us. Not everybody bought into that. Not everybody said, I was guilty of that. We should have got rid of those people earlier, whatever, you know. There's always a little bit of that, but there was a lot of brokenness over that, a lot of brokenness over all the issues, and so God really used that. And I think for many years, as people would say, they put down a nail there and said they learn what obedience was about and the importance, first of all, our salvation, but also having a short list of things we need to be obedient about.
Right. Yeah.
Wow, that's a powerful time. That's an incredible story, and you're right. I think the last time we gathered with some of the team from Life Action, that article, I had never seen that physical article, and we got to read that. That was really cool. There's one last thing that I wanted to ask you about. I know we've kept you way over time, and this is maybe at this point we're into part 2 of this podcast. We'll have to let Blake ask us. But one of the other things that I have heard you talk a ton about and got to experience for a short period of time that I think was a huge, important part of your life, and was your friendship with Jack. And that was Jack came here later on, wasn't here your entire time at Fredonia Hill, but you two were quite the pair. I've heard plenty of stories of the two of you figuring out ministry together in the context of friendship, and it's something that, I mean, even this podcast, the foundation of this podcast is trying to push and encourage people to have the sorts of conversations that lead to deeper relationship. And you and Jack certainly shared deep connection and friendship, but you also were fleshing out your faith and what it looked like to serve God and love your families and raise your family. You were doing all of that together. Talk a little bit. I know it's a really probably tough question, but talk a little bit about Jack specifically, but also just the way in which deep friendship for you was so important in the formation of your faith and in following Jesus, and kind of how he played a role in that.
Well, we were going to our young adult class here, and I remember I didn't know Janice well, but she was in there, and I remember one particular Sunday school morning, or we knew she'd lost her husband along the way, and I don't remember if it was a Sunday school party or Sunday school. She said, hey, I met somebody. Well, it was Jack, and she's got her own story. I know she's done a podcast, and I don't know exactly if that was 76, 77-ish along in there, but I really remember them getting married, coming to church, and kind of getting to know him, because we got a lot of people. Our church was, as I said, had a lot of people back then. And I knew who Jack was, and it seems like our first, I may have this wrong, but it seems like that they approached us and said, hey, we'd like to go skiing in Angel Fire. Would y'all want to go? So that really began our real relationship of going skiing at Angel Fire. And then it seems like we went 2 or 3 times a year there for a while. And so that was good. And then we got in a men's group together, but we did things together. We both got to be young deacons in our church. A lot of our older people had left or were retiring, I guess you'd say, maybe. And so we did begin to have leadership responsibilities together, So I wish I could give you a good story about how those things develop. But we are a product of all those kinds of relationships we have. Now, we work together in Sunday school. Jack started a college department up at the Red Barn. I started a young adult Sunday school class in our church. And I've had the opportunity to start 2 Sunday school classes from scratch. And I don't think I've done either one of them well, but that first one, we ended up about 40 young couples in there. It was a time in our church where we had a lot of couples. But anyway, we had relationships. Now, I want to go back to one other person in my life. So when Brother Dotson was here, it's kind of interesting. He was a pastor. He was only staff member, and we had 600 or 700 people. So I don't know what that tells you guys.
I don't know what we're doing.
So, the music guys were always laymen. We didn't have any. But we finally hired another staff. And it was back then they called them ministers of education. Mm-hmm. And the first one we hired was a guy named Gene Ortiz. And Gene and his wife still are very dear friends of ours. Mm. And so Gene was about my age, maybe a year older. This would have been in, I don't know, the early 70s. He graduated from Southwestern. They hired him. He came here, and he was young go-ho. He started what I realized later was discipleship, but I didn't know what he was doing. He said, "Hey, George, we're friends." So we started going out to eat together, started having relationships together, being friends. His wife, my wife, our kids were born about the same time. And one of the things he did that I should do, but I don't, but he said, "Why don't we start memorizing Scripture together?" So we started a process that lasted for the whole time he was here. One week I would get a Scripture verse, and we would memorize it all week, and we'd have to report it to each other. And then he'd get one. And a lot of the Scripture, much of the Scripture that I know now in my heart came from those days. And even now, I find myself, and I know y'all think this is strange, but I'm a strange person. I'll wake up in the middle of the night, and I'll be quoting one of those scriptures I learned however many 40, 50 years ago. But if we would all do that with Christian brothers, but anyway, but Jack and I did do a lot of stuff together. We went through Evangelism Explosion together. And at that time was when you'd go out every Tuesday night, knock on some door, go in there, and you had your scripts you'd memorized. And I'm not saying that bad. I've done every one of the evangelisms from 4 Spiritual Laws and Evangelism Explosion to Faith to all of them. And I think they all have good benefit. But it's when you learn those, it becomes part of your life. But we started doing that together. Jack witnessed a lot of people. Oftentimes he'd call me, "Hey, we got to go over to somebody's house and let's share the faith." So we did do that life together, and I benefited more from him than I know he ever benefited from me. But we did that together, and it was really, really good. And I just wish, as I look back on my life, that I had built into others more intentionally. But, I am where I am. But
yeah, that's good. Well, thank you for sharing that. I want to just close kind of with one last question. I know I said the last one was maybe the last one, but one last question. George, you've seen several different seasons in the life of this church. You've seen several seasons in the life of this community. You've seen what God has done here in really wonderful times, and then also in really tough, trying times. What is it, as you look at the church today, and I don't even necessarily just mean Fredonia Hill, but just as you look across the landscape of the church today and in our community, however you want to take this perspective, but what gives you hope about the church today? What gives you hope as you look into the future? I think that would be from your perspective, I think that would be really beneficial to hear. Just what brings you hope?
Well, what doesn't bring me hope is when I read things that are negative about that people are going away from church, and what percentage of young couples don't believe there is a God, or they don't believe that marriage is important, or all those kind of things. So I have to steer away from reading that kind of stuff. And what gives me hope is when I hear things about the Asbury College revival, what God's doing even in our own college ministry. And there's a lot. Now, we were fortunate. God really blessed, and we baptized a lot of people this year. But how many places we've seen that? I've got a pastor friend of mine, John Lanou, who's 89 years old, and he still is just on fire for the Lord, doing things all the time. And this week, he's helped begin a ministry in Uganda. And he said last year they prayed that they would baptize 400 people in that ministry in Uganda. They've baptized already this year almost 500 people. So there's a movement of God on college campuses around the world. Thousands of people are coming to faith everywhere. Now, if we focus on the negative, we'll get depressed about that. But if we can focus on the positive, what God is doing, what He can do, we'll have a hope and a bright for the future. And I believe it is. I believe there's going to be a great ingathering. And I just hope we're all able to visualize that and see that and experience that. Because what greater thrill is it for a believer to see somebody else to move from darkness to light?
Wow. Well, it's a wonderful way to close. I so appreciate your time and thoughtfulness there. And just, man, on behalf of all of us that have been able to benefit just from interacting with you, thank you for your encouragement. Thank you for the hope that you have given us. George is one of the things you don't know about George is that at every opportunity that he gets, he makes a personal attempt to come and encourage us. And you've done that for me and have been an encouragement for the entirety of my ministry here. And so thank you for that. Listen, we've covered a lot. We've covered a lot of ground here. And I know we've covered a lot of different topics too, a wide range of things. And husbands, I know that you're preparing for tomorrow morning.
Yeah, go ahead and get ready to make that coffee.
Get ready to make that coffee. Get that soda ready. George has educated us on marriage and dating and church life and the whole thing. But we want to hear from you. We want to hear just what has been said today that's impacted you. How have you been challenged by George's story? What are you thinking about maybe more deeply today than you were before, just because of this time? And think about this too. Don't lose sight of why we're even doing this. Who might you be able to sit down across the table with? As George just talked about, friendship and the importance of that. And as we grow in Jesus, who could you sit down with today? Who could you start swapping memory verses with? Who might you invite to lunch or coffee or breakfast or your home, where you could start to share what God's doing in your life and challenge one another? What impact might that make for you and for generations to come? So we want to hear about that. How has this encouraged you? How have you been challenged? You know the ways to reach us, and we got more guests coming.
Yeah, we
more
do.
Episodes coming up, so stay tuned for that, and we will see you next time. Adios.